Imagine working 70 hours a week, traveling thousands of miles, sleeping in your truck, and still struggling to make ends meet. Now imagine being told that the reason your industry is collapsing is because there aren't enough people like you. That's the myth the trucking industry has been selling for years. But what if the problem isn't a shortage of drivers? What if the problem is the industry itself? This is the hidden story of trucking in America, where behind every delivery is a driver who's been overworked, underpaid, and often forgotten. It's a system held together not by efficiency or innovation, but by the endurance of people pushed to their limits. This isn't a labor shortage, it's a crisis of exploitation. Every few months, headlines shout about a nationwide truck driver shortage. The American Trucking Associations have estimated the country is short tens of thousands of drivers. It's framed as an emergency, but the numbers tell a different story. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and independent research from labor economists, there isn't a lack of people with commercial driver's licenses, CDLs. In fact, over 3.5 million people in the U.S. hold a CDL. The issue is that many of them choose not to work in the industry anymore. Why? Because they've already tried it. And they left. The truth is, the trucking industry has one of the highest turnover rates in the country, over 90% annually in some sectors like long-haul freight. Think about that. Imagine if 9 out of 10 employees at your job left every year. That wouldn't be a hiring issue. That would be a system failure. To really understand why things are the way they are today, we need to rewind to the 1970s, a time when being a truck driver wasn't just a job. It was a solid, respected career. Back then, trucking was a pathway to the middle class. Drivers earned union wages, had access to pensions, and could provide for a family on a single income. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sustainable. Long-haul routes were demanding, but the compensation reflected that. Trucking was considered a skilled trade, and those behind the wheel were treated as professionals. Much of this was due to regulation. The Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, controlled entry into the industry. Companies had to apply for operating authority, and prices for freight were set in advance. This may have limited competition, but it ensured predictability for carriers, shippers, and especially drivers. Unions like the International Brotherhood of Teamsters wielded real power. They negotiated strong contracts that included fair pay, overtime, benefits, and job protections. Strike threats carried weight. The balance of power was distributed, workers had a seat at the table. But by the late 1970s, the winds of economic policy were shifting. Inflation was high, interest rates were climbing, and many economists, along with political leaders, believed deregulation was the answer to sluggish productivity. Enter the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. Signed into law by President Jimmy Carter, the act aimed to stimulate the economy by introducing free market principles into the transportation sector. In practice, it stripped away federal oversight of pricing and allowed virtually anyone to start a trucking company. At first glance, the move seemed pro-business and consumer-friendly. Competition would increase, prices would drop, shipping would become more efficient, and that did happen temporarily. But the deregulation also triggered what some economists now call a race to the bottom. New carriers flooded the market, often undercutting each other with ultra-low bids to win contracts. To make up for the thin margins, companies cut costs wherever they could. Guess where they started? Labor. Wages for truckers plummeted. Benefits were slashed, and working conditions began to erode. As non-union companies expanded rapidly, union carriers started losing business and workers. The Teamsters Union, once a political powerhouse, saw its membership in trucking erode year after year. By the mid-1980s, the transformation was visible. The industry had gone from being highly structured to being cutthroat and chaotic. Small companies came and went, many unable to survive the volatility they helped create. Larger companies, often backed by corporate conglomerates, consolidated power, driving out local operators and undermining what little stability remained. For independent truckers, things were especially difficult. They had to compete not just with each other, but with massive carriers that could afford to operate at a loss just long enough to squeeze them out. Access to lucrative routes became more restricted, and without union contracts, these independents had no one to advocate for fair treatment. The number of trucking strikes plummeted not because things improved, but because organizing became nearly impossible in an increasingly fractured workforce. Today, only about 10% of truck drivers are unionized, down from over 50% in the early 1970s. And those lost protections, they never came back. In many ways, the Motor Carrier Act marked the end of the golden era of American trucking. It transformed a blue-collar profession with a path to upward mobility into a fragmented industry built on precarity. Supporters of deregulation argue it modernized transportation and lowered costs for consumers. But critics point to the long-term costs: high turnover, wage stagnation, and a class of workers who now carry a nation's freight on their backs without the stability, security, or dignity they once had. And perhaps most telling is this: while freight companies have grown into billion-dollar enterprises, many of their drivers live paycheck to paycheck. That's not progress. That's a warning. One of the biggest issues drivers face is how they're paid. Most drivers don't earn a salary or hourly wage. They're paid per mile. If they're not moving, they're not earning. Here's the problem. Truckers don't just spend time driving. They spend hours waiting at distribution centers for their loads, sitting in traffic, navigating inspections, or stuck in rest stops. None of that is compensated. According to a study by the U.S. Department of Transportation, long-haul truckers lose an average of 2.5 hours every day to unpaid delays. In any other job, this would be unacceptable. Imagine working a 12-hour shift but only getting paid for 7 of those hours. Over time, this adds up to thousands of dollars in unpaid labor each year. It also incentivizes unsafe behavior. Drivers push themselves to make up for lost income, skipping rest, speeding, or driving while fatigued. The cost of this isn't just economic, it's human. For newcomers, the situation isn't any better. Many large trucking companies offer training programs that promise to teach you the ropes and help you get your CDL. Sounds great, right? But there's a catch. These programs often come with contracts agreements that lock drivers in for a year or more. If a driver quits early, they're saddled with thousands of dollars in debt. In some cases, they're sued. And the training, often rushed and inadequate. Some trainees report being pushed into solo driving before they feel ready, risking safety and confidence on the road. It's a pipeline that benefits the company, not the worker. These contracts are sometimes structured to be nearly impossible to break, functioning more like financial shackles than employment agreements. For those who dream of independence, becoming an owner-operator sounds appealing. You buy your own truck, you set your schedule, you're your own boss, but in practice, many independent truckers find themselves struggling even more. Freight rates are unstable, fuel prices fluctuate, maintenance costs are high. Insurance premiums have skyrocketed, and when brokers and shippers delay payments or cancel loads, it's the owner-operator who eats the loss. Some independent drivers report working 60 to 70 hours a week just to break even. If anything goes wrong, a breakdown, a medical issue, a drop in freight demand, they're at risk of losing everything. The dream of freedom quickly becomes a fight for survival. Beyond financial stress, there's the daily grind. Long-haul truckers often spend weeks away from home. They sleep in their trucks, shower at rest stops, and eat whatever they can find on the road. And even those basic services are disappearing. America is facing a serious truck parking shortage. According to a 2019 study from the American Transportation Research Institute, for every 11 drivers on the road, there's just one legal parking space. That means truckers are forced to park in unsafe or illegal spots on highway shoulders, abandoned lots, or crowded shopping centers. And that can lead to fines, theft, or even violence. Add to that a lack of clean bathrooms, limited healthy food, and long stretches of isolation. And it's no wonder so many drivers walk away. This lifestyle takes a toll not just on wallets, but on minds and bodies. Truck drivers are at higher risk for obesity, diabetes, sleep apnea, and depression. Long hours, irregular sleep, and poor access to healthcare make it nearly impossible to manage these conditions. Mental health issues are rarely talked about in the industry. The isolation, pressure, and exhaustion create a perfect storm. In some tragic cases, drivers have taken their own lives, overwhelmed by debt and despair. But there's very little support. No built-in counseling services, no mandatory health checks, no cultural acceptance of taking time off to rest. So what can be done? Experts and advocacy groups have proposed a few key changes. Pay for all hours worked. Compensate drivers for time spent waiting, loading, or dealing with delays. Reform training programs. Ensure transparency and eliminate predatory contracts that trap new drivers in debt. Strengthen labor protections. Support unionization efforts and improve workplace safety standards. Invest in infrastructure. Build more truck-friendly rest stops, parking, and sanitation facilities. Regulate brokers and shippers. Hold companies accountable for delays and unfair pricing practices. And perhaps most importantly, change the narrative. The myth of the driver shortage shifts blame onto workers, but the numbers tell a different story. People want to drive, they just want to be treated fairly while doing it. Truckers keep our economy moving. They deliver our food, medicine, and essential goods. But the system they work in is broken. It's designed to extract as much labor as possible, while giving as little back as it can get away with. Fixing it won't be easy, but it starts by telling the truth, by acknowledging that high turnover isn't a mystery, it's a message, and by recognizing that behind every delivery is a person, a driver, a worker, a human being. Because if the backbone of our economy is crumbling, it's not because of a shortage of drivers. It's because we've made driving unbearable. Thank you for watching. If this message resonated with you, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. Your support helps us bring more attention to stories that matter.